So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Scholar Spotlight here for the Global Policy Next Generation. And I have here incredible Mathieu Blondeel, who works on really fascinating issues on energy transitions and everything. So Mathieu, would you enlighten us about your work and about your current endeavors? We'd love to hear more about what you do.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and quite the honor actually to be put in the spotlight as a scholar. So thanks for that. So currently I'm involved in a really fascinating research project, which is, and I have to say this, funded by the UK Energy Research Centre, or UKERC, and the research project is entitled UK Energy in a Global Context. And I'm located at the Warwick Business School in the UK then. And so the project basically has two work streams. There's one on, this is quite a mouthful, the geopolitical economy of energy system transformation. And then there's another one on the implications of Brexit for the UK's decarbonization and climate policies. And in the past year or so, I've been mainly focusing on the first work stream, the geopolitics one, primarily because Brexit has dragged on for such a long time, of course. But so in short, I'm basically interested in the geopolitics and the economy of the energy system transformation. So, for example, I'm interested in questions such as what does a shift away from a world economy driven by hydrocarbons to one driven by electrons mean for our conceptualization of energy security? What impact does or will this transformation have on the political standing of large fossil fuel producers such as Russia and Saudi Arabia, but also, for example, their domestic political economies? What are the threats and opportunities associated with an increased reliance on so-called critical materials such as cobalt, nickel, lithium, and the likes that will be so crucial for these low carbon technologies? And another research question that we've been looking at recently is how do international oil companies strategically adapt to this new reality of energy system transformation? And so those are basically the types of questions that I'm primarily looking at these days at the business school.
Really fascinating research. And we spoke a bit about your transition from, international relations and political science to business school, which is really fascinating. So can you give us a bit, people following this similar path or thinking about similar path, what motivated your PhD and how it led to your postdoctoral research motivations? How did you connect the two? And what advice would you have to others?
What motivated me in the first place to really pursue a PhD and to do research, for me, the most rewarding thing then is to work in an academic environment in the sense that you can delve into certain societal, political, economic issues that you deem really relevant and interesting. And in my case, that's climate change, energy transitions. And so you can formulate your own questions. You can look at these issues and you spot these issues that you think are really interesting. And you see, and you try to formulate your own questions. And then you can do your own investigative research and your investigative work. And you can basically answer the questions that you asked yourself. And that's what I like about it, because you have this entire ownership over an intellectual process. And that's basically, it has been my main motivation since I've been politically interested in politics since I was a young kid. And so I wanted to pursue that or since I was a teenager at least. And so I wanted to pursue that. And that's what I absolutely love about doing research and working in an academic environment. And so in terms of advice, or what I did was, so basically I got a PhD in international relations, right? And so at one point you really have to ask yourself, so what do I want to do next? And I think if you're in IR and you're in international relations and political science, you're really focused on, or there's still this bias on states, right? States as being the central actors in this anarchic field where states collide or cooperate or fight and then work together on certain issues, etc. And so that's a really interesting approach to international relations and politics, of course. But what I think is really key and what kind of motivated me to go into this business school and see whether there were opportunities there was to look at these issues that we study, climate change, energy transitions, through this lens of, or at least starting from the realization that, well, states aren't the only relevant actors here. We also have to talk about NGOs. We have to talk about international organizations. We have to talk about businesses. We have to talk about institutional investors, etc. And especially in the realm of climate change and energy transitions and energy as a whole, these different actors are so crucial to understanding the bigger picture of what's going on, that I think that was one of the motivations, or one of the key motivations for me to really move away somewhat from this state-centric IR perspective on energy transitions, climate change, and climate change politics, to this more holistic approach where you take into account the interests and the preferences of a variety of actors.
It's a good pathway, and I agree with you. Interdisciplinarity really gives you that specific lens that you can explore and pinpoint the details that you might have missed, especially once you have this singular state-centric lens. And I think this is a very important point when we need to think about other perspectives and strategies. And this is really helpful for students that are starting out, because they're given, this formula. So you do X and Y, and this is how it happens. It's really nice to poke holes and try to figure out, well, where does this fit in? Where does this actor go? So I think this is really, really good advice for them. And going back to your work, because you're doing so much on energy transitions, on net zero energy, I remember norms, all of this, and now with the work school, you're doing this interesting trajectories in terms of what do we do, how do we deal with energy of the future, right? So what made you interested? You talked about, politics motivating you go to PhD. What made you interested in climate change and energy as a topic in specific?
When I was still an undergrad and a master's student, and we're talking about early mid 2010s, I think climate change already was, of course, on the top of the global political agenda. I mean, you had the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, or at least the negotiations that led to the accord that was supposed to be the successor to the Kyoto Protocol, and that more or less failed, of course, and you had this political grandstanding around the issue, and it was quite a relevant topic already then. It's not like, or it wasn't like today, of course, but still. And as I said, I was quite a politically engaged student, and at the time I was already reading quite a lot on the topic. And so then in 2015 or so, I think I read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. And that was an absolute eye-opener to me. I mean, she writes, or the way in which she writes about the urgency of climate change, the entire global political economic system that lies at the roots of the problem, and partially about what could be done about that. I mean, that was an absolute eye-opener for me. And so for me, that was a true trigger to really push myself, because at the time I was doing a master's in London. And then I stayed in touch with a couple of old professors that I had from Ghent University in Belgium. And they told me that there was a position opening up at the university to start doing research on fossil fuel divestment campaigns and fossil fuel subsidy reform campaigns. And so I'd read the book. I was really interested in it. I wanted to pursue a career in academia because I was so interested in it. So, I mean, when that opportunity came along, I had no choice but to apply for the position, and then I got it.
Oh, that's such a wonderful journey. And I think that ties into one question that I have later on with what was the role of Naomi's book, because you recommend it to everyone. So it has been fundamental in a way in shaping your career. And I think it had for everybody that read the book. It just touches you so deeply. All of Naomi's books, I feel like they just are such an eye opener. So I think it's interesting how, how what we read and how what we hear and what's happening around just really shapes our career journeys. And then this opening of a position, I found this is such a good journey and such an encouraging way to go about it. So what was the most rewarding thing? Because you had so many interesting ideas. What was one of them that has been the most rewarding to you, or where you felt that you've contributed to the best way along your PhD, along your postdoc career, or even before in academia?
One of the most rewarding things for me is that the research that we're doing, or research that I'm doing, is so it's so topically, it's so societally relevant. I think, first of all, climate change is so relevant because it's no longer something that we might experience in the distant future. It's already at our doorsteps. I mean, in Belgium here, there were floods a couple of weeks ago, and 30 plus people died in the climate, or in those floods that climate change make far more, or in those floods that are to a certain extent induced by climate change. So it's no longer something that will potentially occur in the future. It's already happening today. So through our research and through our trying to grasp what's going on politically, how we're trying to formulate answers to these issues through, amongst others, this global energy transition, through our understanding of that, I think we can help formulate answers that might be relevant for policymakers that have to engage with these questions. So I think for me, that's really the most rewarding thing, that if you write a paper, or when you write a paper and you finished it and you've gone through the entire review process, and you've written something, and it's not only about getting it published in a good political science journal or IR journal, it's really taking your findings to the public and descend from the what is often considered the academic ivory tower, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the most rewarding things about the fact that it's so topical, what I write about, the geopolitics of energy transitions and climate politics, is that I can take these findings, I can write op-eds about it, I can write blog posts about it, I can be interviewed about it, and those interviews can appear in certain media outlets, and people outside of the ivory tower will read it as well. And I think that's really crucial to our job as academics, as young academics as well, that we shouldn't only focus on getting our research published in the best journals, academic journals. Of course, that's important, because that's the solid scientific basis of what we do. But then take that science and those findings and bring it to the public. I think that's a rewarding thing in my research.
That's a good point. And once we have, and this is also possibly reaching some policymakers, hopefully down the line. So what would be your message to them if they were to, find this video and say, well, what would you tell us? What would you like policymakers to know in terms of, what should they do in the future, how they should approach it? Because as you said, we are facing this crisis, outside.
Well, I think one of the key points is that as we're facing climate change and as we're preparing and already going through this transition phase, we really have to pay attention, and policymakers in particular really have to pay attention to this issue of a just transition, right? And for me, that's just basically one of the key issues. So finally, I think already among policymakers, it's something that social scientists and political scientists have long known, that the fundamental changes to the energy system will have vast political, economic, social, cultural repercussions, right? And so if left unmanaged, this transition will clearly hit the poorest, the most vulnerable people the hardest, and they will bear the heaviest cost. And so that's already occurring in the global south. Think about the climate change induced famine in Madagascar. What have the Madagascarian people done in terms of fossil fuel or carbon emissions to be suffering through these famines? I mean, so what you basically have to do, you really have to make sure that these transitions that we're trying to implement today are just. We should think about how we can make sure that industrialized states or post-industrialized states help these nations, such as Madagascar, adapt to and mitigate climate change by providing finance, subsidies, even debt restructuring, right? And so these just transitions, of course, don't only have to be directed to provide financial support to developing countries or the global south. It also has to be about what are we going to do with these workers in coal mines in Poland, the workers, the oil workers in Canada, for example, as well. How are we going to make sure that they get the right financial support, that their families and households get the right support, ones that are going to lose their jobs and they have to find another job, right? So I think in terms of advice, or perhaps not advice, but in terms of what I think is a really crucial policy issue around this whole notion of the geopolitical economy of energy system transformation, is this notion of a just transition. That's absolutely key here.
Yes, you're right. And what if, so once we have this message to the policymakers, how do we then deliver it to the academics if we do refocus the field more in the just transitions, go into this trajectory? What do you anticipate changing in the way how we look at things, how we analyze things? Do you think there's going to be more progressive thinking if we went that direction, or is there still something missing in that trajectory?
We just did a big review article, and we reviewed the literature on the geopolitics of energy and energy transitions of the past 10 years. I did that with my colleagues at Warwick University and Durham University.
Oh, lovely.
And what we find there is that, especially in the geopolitics literature, again, it's very much about a great power competition, right? It's all about what is the US going to do? What does it mean if China sits on top of all these rare earth elements and controls the supply chains of these critical materials that I talked about earlier, lithium, cobalt, copper, and the likes, right? So it's really very much focused on this great power competition about supply chains. But what I like, and here more critical geography studies perhaps come in, and more critical social studies come in, and it's really going down from this very aggregate great power level, state level, and going down and looking at subnational level, household level, individual level, and really looking at how individuals are being affected by all these changes. And I think for academics, even IR scholars, there's a lot to learn from these more critical fields of study. And to come back to another issue that we talked about earlier, in terms of, so I think a key issue here is interdisciplinarity, right? And so we talked about it before, and that's, so I'm a trained IR scholar, and now I'm working at a business school. And so what I find really interesting is, in a lot of the IR literature or the political science literature on energy transitions, fossil fuel companies are really seen as this monolithic block, right? But if you approach it, and there are evil corporations that are holding back any reform and through their lobbying practices, and well, you know the story, right? And so what I really find interesting now from this, now that I'm talking to my business school colleagues, and we approach it we approach this issue of energy transitions from the perspective of the literature on business, on management, on strategy studies, then the picture becomes a bit more nuanced, right? And again, I think this interdisciplinary approach is really crucial to get an entire picture and to understand more intrinsically what is going on, how energy system transformation isn't only this great power competition between the US, China, the EU, and Russia and Saudi Arabia. It's also a competition between companies. It's competition between perhaps even individuals and households, etc. And I think that's really important to understand. This drive for interdisciplinarity is something that I would really think might be a crucial issue for scholarship going forward.
I completely agree with you. The interdisciplinary lens is really something we need to push forward and work on it, because you never know what you learn from the other side of the field, right? Sometimes those miniature additions are actually the ones that were holding you back from progress, from working on it. So, and doing the same with my work, I find similar things, strategy management, really interesting insights into what we thought is, really nice blank boxes in political science. Oh, let's keep it this box, right? No, we actually unpack it. Let's look at it. Let's look at the other side. Let's push through it. I think this is where the innovation comes through.
Yeah,
So this
absolutely.
is really good to hear. And going back, your work is so interesting because it all ties up really nicely, because you mentioned in your questionnaire that you really enjoy Antonio Gramsci. And so what we've been talking about, it's a bit of a Gramscian in a way analysis. So do you let us know what was his influence in your work?
Well, the thing about it is that he's influenced, perhaps not my career, because I think the question you sent me, how did he influence my career or my academic career? He died in 1937, so he hadn't really practically impacted my career. But he's such an inspirational philosopher, thinker, political scientist, homo universalis, actually, basically.
Yeah.
And so what I learned from my courses, my introduction to politics courses, is that politics is about power, or the distribution of power, right? And so I think that also goes for climate and energy politics. And what is crucial for Gramsci is that, I'm inspired by more Marxist approaches to politics and to understanding society as a whole. And what Gramsci basically says is that power isn't exclusively derived from material resources. The power isn't only economic, right? And that's what conventional Marxists would rather say. So what Gramsci actually says, and this is so fascinating, is that, well, power, or what he calls hegemony, of course, is derived from an interplay of coercion and economic force, but it's also constructed through societal consent, through discourses, through narratives, through social norms, through networks or coalitions of different actors, and not just economic actors, but other societal actors, NGOs, and other relevant stakeholders and policymakers and the like. So I think that's really crucial. And for me, and I wrote that as well earlier, this shows me two things. I think, first of all, agency plays a very crucial role in maintaining, but also undermining unequal power relations. And second, and this goes out specifically to climate advocates or climate activists, this means that the strategic use of narratives and building coalitions with businesses, investors, policymakers, and other stakeholders can help you build an alliance against vested interests that still seek to delay, it is nowadays, because now we're talking about climate delay, right? That still seek to delay action. And I don't know if there's time for an example, but I really want to give you this example, and it's also in Naomi Klein's book, and that's about fossil fuel divestment. And I've done research on that, of course, for my PhD, and I'm still looking at that campaign actively. And so the fossil fuel divestment campaign, basically what these campaigners say is, well, institutional or individual investors, you have to withdraw your investments from fossil fuel assets, and you have to reinvest them in green investments, whatever they may be. You have to take your pension funds should stop investing in BP or Shell or ExxonMobil. So that's the crux of their message. So fossil fuel divestment campaign. And so looking at this campaign through a neo-Gramscian lens basically uncovers a lot of really fascinating stuff. Because let's first talk about discourse, right? So discursively, they've used such powerful framing to promote their message, their divestment message. They employ terms like stranded assets, carbon bubble, and they really cloak their arguments in the language of risk management, portfolio diversification, profit maximization. And that's really language. And those are really frames that speak to the financial community, to those pension funds, to these asset managers, to these hedge funds, and those types of actors. So what they do through really building and these narratives, constructing these frames, right? they try to reach out to other stakeholders, to other groups of actors, and they build these coalitions with actors, right? These actors that are still taken, and it's really sad to say, that are taken far more seriously in fossil fuel boardrooms than the climate activist vote, right? If you have the CEO of BlackRock saying, well, we're no longer going to invest in coal mining, then those fossil fuel companies are going to start listening to them. But if you're out in the street with your thingy and you're shouting no more investments in coal mining, well, you have less power. But it's through engaging with these discourses, through building these coalitions, and so constructing and expanding your discursive power and your organizational power, as neo-Gramscianists would call it, then you can really attack the fundamental material power of these fossil fuel companies. Because if all these financial actors, those banks, those insurers, those institutional investors, those pension funds are saying, well, we're taking our hands off the fossil fuel industry, then those companies will find it far more difficult to get money in the financial markets to continue to fund their businesses and their action and their extractive actions. And so that's how this interplay of different forms of power, of discursive power, of organizational power, and material power come together in this whole story of fossil fuel divestment. And that's why I think the neo-Gramscian take on power is so powerful for social scientists to understand what's going on.
Indeed. Are you writing a book on this? Are you planning to?
No, I've written a paper on that, and I'm writing or I've written a book chapter on that as well.
Okay, so everybody that wants to look into it deeper should be able to access. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, it's good. Yeah, it's good to have those sources because you mentioned so many interesting ideas, and I think a lot of our listeners would love to get their hands on it because this is so interesting to trace all of the details and unpack them in such a fascinating way. So before we wrap up, and because this is targeting for early career academics, early career researchers, what would be your advice to them? And you mentioned that they should be flexible about doing research even in non-academic settings. And I find it really fascinating because this is not an advice that we usually hear. They talk, if you don't get into a PhD, you consider other options. What are other options? How do you consider? And research is our primary aims.
Yeah, well, I think, and that's something that opened my eyes as well, because I went to a business school. And so you engage far more with these consultancies and research institutions and even companies and consultancies that work outside of academia, that still do really fascinating stuff. And I think, to be honest, I would definitely urge you to, if you want to pursue a PhD, you should do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I definitely say do it. But once you've done it, really ask yourself, if I still want to continue to do research, is academia the only place in which I can do that? And to be honest, from what I see and from the reports that I read from these fascinating companies, I'm not going to advertise any here. Then I really think that there is an opportunity for you if you're working in the field of energy, environmental politics, climate politics, and you really want to think about what might happen next in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, then there's really an opportunity to engage with these types of companies or research institutions or consultancies. I really think that.
Oh, this is a terrific advice, actually, to think about, because a lot of people, once they're wrapping a PhD, they don't really know what to do next. Or some of them have obviously idea, yes, I want to continue in academia. But I think those different opportunities, they really make it easier on us and the stress levels. Oh, if I don't get into academia, what do I do next, right?
Yeah.
And so knowing that there is an alternative path, alternative way to go about it is really good. It's like a option B, which is, always good to have more options than, oh, I fail at this, I'm not going to go anyway. So no, it's good to have that. Perfect. Any wrapping up thoughts, Matthew, that you want to share with Policy Next Generation listeners today?
It's like I said, I mean, if you're a master's student and you're definitely interested in doing research and you like writing and just in general, you like absorbing knowledge, then I think a PhD that's the way to go. Yeah, I mean, I think that those might be some good final words. A PhD is something. I mean, I don't know how it works in other countries, but in Belgium you have 4 years. I had 4 years to really delve into a couple of cases and this fascinating field of I mean issues at the intersection of climate and energy politics. And there's so much going on in there. And there's so much to uncover still. There are so many issues still to resolve. And as an academic, you're so well placed to develop your own voice in all these ongoing debates, your own well-informed voice. And I mean, it's definitely worth pursuing that PhD.
It's a good advice. Yes, I echo everything that you said. I think the development of new minds, new thinkers, new ideas is fascinating. It starts from the early age. As you start your PhD, you really carve your niche, you really become that expert that we need. I think we should incentivize more and more people to kind of join in the movement and lead us toward this different trajectories. So I'm so glad that you found time in your really busy schedule to speak with us and share your insights and ideas and unravel this amazing world of just transitions. What do we do next? So thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights and advice with our listeners. So yeah, pleasure having you here.
Yeah, thank you.